Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, February 16th, 2021, and today we're seeing headlines from last night and also this morning discussing former Senator David Perdue, who now is looking to challenge Raphael Warnock, the newly elected senator, the Reverend from Georgia, the first black senator from the state, for the 2022 United States Senate election. Now, when Raphael Warnock was elected back in 2021, this is 2018, we'll get to that in just a moment. When he was elected back in 2021, well, this year, he was elected to serve out the remainder of this term, which means that he's up in 2022 for a full seat, meaning whoever wins in 2022 will be elected for 6 years, the next time being up in 2028. And Raphael Warnock did not defeat David Perdue. He defeated Kelley, the appointed senator appointed by Governor Brian Kemp, who ended up losing by a 2-point margin in a runoff election that was expected to not do too well for the Democratic Party. But with Raphael Warnock's victory, David Perdue was also defeated by Senator Jon Ossoff in January 2021. And looking at this new comeback bid, history tells us this won't work, and everything tells us this won't work. It's as if the GOP doesn't know who to run now that the GOP seems to be cracked right in the middle down in Georgia. You see, what happened in 2018 was Brian Kemp won the governorship, not by a lot. He won the governorship against Stacey Abrams. We can take a look at the governor's races here and look at the state of Georgia. It was an exceptionally close race. Donald Trump had won the state by nearly 6 points just 2 years prior, and Brian Kemp defeats Stacey Abrams by a margin of 1.4%. I mean, it was exceptionally close looking at the margin between the two candidates, and at the end of the day, it was expected to be a close race in 2020. But no one would really expect that Joe Biden would have won Georgia and won Arizona without winning Florida or without winning North Carolina. It definitely shocked the nation by not only going to Joe Biden, but flipping control of the United States Senate. But when Brian Kemp was elected, he's currently serving out his 4-year term. Other statewide officials were elected with him, and under his watch, Joe Biden was able to win the state of Georgia on the presidential level, in which Donald Trump said was fraudulent. He said that Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State, and that Brian Kemp was a Republican in name only. The word rhino is something that Donald Trump floats around very easily to anyone who doesn't wholeheartedly support his cause. And it's not as if Brian Kemp didn't wholeheartedly support his cause. Brian Kemp was probably one of the biggest proponents for Donald Trump in the state of Georgia, but it was just an unfortunate timing, an unfortunate result for Brian Kemp in that state that he had to defend it because he could not say our own Republican state, our own Republican legislature, our own Republican officials allowed voter fraud, because there was no voter fraud, and Brian Kemp knew it, Brad Raffensperger knew it, Donald Trump knew it, but the message needed to be there for Donald Trump to accuse these Republicans in Arizona, Doug Ducey, now censored by the Arizona GOP. We have Brian Kemp in the state of Georgia, vilified by members of the right wing. And that's largely due to the fact that they are saying they allowed voter fraud. But at the end of the day, no matter what Donald Trump tried to do, it just simply didn't work. But David Perdue was caught in a loop. David Perdue was caught between appeasing those Republicans he had won over previously, those moderate Republicans or even independents who had typically leaned to the right, that had elected Perdue, that had elected other Republicans more so than they did Donald Trump. But looking at, balancing that, it was very difficult to try to balance the Trump wing of the Republican Party who was saying Georgia was completely fraudulent, and also the more moderate wing that elected Joe Biden. I mean, it just was a very difficult position that David Perdue was in, and ultimately he was defeated. And now that he's looking to run in 2022, when I mentioned in the beginning of the video that history tells us this isn't going to work, 2020 was a perfect example of that. 2016 was also a perfect example of that, and we'll talk about why. It's not just former senators, it's former candidates that return 2 to 4 years later to 6 years later just to the same seat that ultimately end up losing because they were rejected by the voters once, and it's easy to see how they could be rejected again. And given that the Senate comes down to every single seat now that it's 50-50, David Perdue may not be the strongest Republican to run in Georgia. I think he's being floated as the frontrunner currently because he's a recognizable name. He just held the Senate seat, but a different one. Still a Senate seat regardless, and he definitely isn't done with Georgia politics. When he released his defeat statement, or his not so congratulatory statement to Jon Ossoff, but more so a concession speech, if anything, really not even addressing the fact that Ossoff had won the race the way that other Republicans had, even Kelley had. That's what the comparison I want to make is, his concession speech was worse, or not even speech, statement, because he wasn't on the Senate floor. It was different very different than Kelley Loeffler's. And I found that very surprising because I expected her to go full Trump wing and say that the election was rigged. But David Perdue took longer. And on top of that, he just seemed so, upset with the election results. And I understand, you're losing a Senate race that you would have won had the Libertarian Party candidate not been in the race. But at the same time, the voters spoke. And you have to recognize democracy working in full action. And I think he's really angry that Jon Ossoff was able to win a race. Now he's until 2026, and he wants to return to the United States Senate. But let's talk about the historical context. Does this work? There are always exceptions to rules, but in modern history, at least Trump-era history, 2016 onward, looking at the results of elections, typically these returns don't win. Let's take a look at Arizona as a perfect example. Martha McSally hands 2 Senate seats to the Democratic Party in back-to-back years. We're talking 2018 and 2020. Let's zoom in on the 2018 election results in Arizona. That's the governor's race. Let's get over to the Senate races. Looking at Kyrsten Sinema's margin of victory, she defeated Martha McSally by 2.4%. In 2020, Mark Kelley defeated Martha McSally by a very... by the same amount, 2.4%, a 2.4% margin of victory in both instances. And actually, it's very interesting to see because looking at the county map, what do you see? The exact same result. And the reason for that is because Martha McSally, while originally a strong candidate on paper, is not always the best person to run. When you're looking at her, someone who was rejected by voters in 2018, it made no sense for Doug Ducey to appoint her. After John McCain's unfortunate passing, he should have nominated someone who was close to McCain, not someone who had just been rejected. I understand the Arizona GOP certainly wanted to put her in a position of power, and the Senate might have been a good position, but 2020, 2 years after, we're talking this would have been a good position 10, 20 years after for a term that would be up soon, but it wouldn't make sense to tell the voters who just rejected her 2 years prior, this is like a slap in the face. And that's why Martha McSally won less of the vote than Donald Trump in this state. There's a reason why someone who was very strong previously was winning in an arguably competitive district on the House level that is now likely for the Democratic Party. I mean, Martha McSally was a good candidate after, her House races, but looking at 2018, it was just not a good environment for her, and I don't think she was lackluster in 2018. I think Kyrsten Sinema lucked out. I think through her ingenuity and her campaign tactic, they were able to win Arizona, but 2020 should not have been an automatic pickup, but it was because of Martha McSally. And she's not the only one that ran again that lost in 2018. John James came close in 2020. He came closer than he did in 2018, but the national environment was very different. John James nearly won, but he lost by 1.7%. He was a return candidate. If you take a look at the 2018 Senate election results in Michigan, the same name is on the ballot. He was defeated by 7 points in 2018. He was defeated by just a little bit under 2 percentage points, but a defeat is a defeat. It doesn't matter the margin. When you rerun a candidate who was just rejected by voters, that is a slap in the face. That is essentially saying, I'm going to run again. And it's different than it is on the presidential level because you get a lot of support from the national incumbent party, or the national party, whether the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. If Trump was to run again in 2024, I don't think it would be viewed as much of a slap in the face as a return 2 years later or a return to the same Senate seat that voters ousted you. When you're an incumbent and you're in a race and you lose and you return, for David Perdue's case 1 year later, voters are going to say, we literally just rejected you. Why would we want you again? They may seem like a recognizable name and may make it through a primary on that accord just because they are the former senator representing that party. But when it comes down to the general election, independents who voted against you previously are not going to find any type of incentive to vote for you again. That's the problem with running previous candidates. If you didn't win before, and I understand John James increased the vote, but the national environment was different. The fact that Martha McSally couldn't even outperform Donald Trump, I find very interesting. Mark Kelley may have been a strong candidate. Martha McSally certainly was not good 2 years later. John James, had they ran any other Republican, I think actually could have come close because looking at the margin, Gary Peters underperformed Joe Biden. Why? He was not as much of a recognizable name in this state. He didn't have as much of a broad coalition in this region, especially with someone, comparing it to under the Obama administration who bailed out the auto industry. Joe Biden's name was just a very popular name across the Rust Belt, recognizable name, maybe not necessarily popular in every region, but Gary Peters certainly wasn't in the state of Michigan, which is why I think he underperformed him. But looking at the Georgia runoff election results, David Perdue lost. He didn't lose by the same margin as Donald Trump. He lost by more. Donald Trump lost by 12,000 votes. David Perdue lost by nearly 50,000 votes. I mean, looking at the difference, actually more than 50,000 votes, 54,000 votes separate the two candidates currently. Looking at the Georgia runoff election results, what happened was a lot of states. Let's go ahead and take a look at the full Georgia results. I want to go ahead and do the shift from November. What happened in the regular race was that every single state, every single county had voted to the right of where it was in the runoff election. Look at all of these. I mean, there are obviously a few exceptions, 3.6% more Republican, 1.4, 0.5. But main takeaway is the entire state shifted to the left, because these candidates were not popular. And when you take a look at the approval rating of newly elected, Senator Jon Ossoff, he has a 50% approval rating. Looking at a 40% unfavorability rating, Raphael Warnock also has a 54% approval rating and a 37% disapproval rating. And looking at the Republican Party in the state, the Republican Party is disapproved of, whereas the Democratic Party is approved of in the state of Georgia. The problem is that these senators, David Perdue, Martha McSally, John James, or these candidates are tied so closely to the Trump administration and to Donald Trump that they probably won't be able to win elections in the future because of that, especially in states that are getting more Democratic than they were in 2016. All three of those states I mentioned voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. But I had mentioned that during the Trump era, there were some other senators that returned to try to run for races, and this happened in 2016. What we saw in Wisconsin and Indiana and neighboring areas, both part of the Rust Belt, were former candidates and former senators that had lost or ended up not running for re-election. Let's take Wisconsin, for example. Ron Johnson, who's actually up in 2022. We'll talk about him in future videos because he's in a competitive race. But Russ Feingold ran in 2016. He ran as he was a former senator from this state. He held this specific Senate seat. Ron Johnson ended up defeating him. Again, he defeated him in 2010 by a larger margin, but looking at the overall margin of victory in 2016, it wasn't too far off. You see, the problem was not only did Donald Trump win the state, but Ron Johnson outperformed him by a lot. Donald Trump won the state by less than a percentage point, and here we have Ron Johnson defeating this candidate by 3.4%. I mean, there's a very big difference between winning by less than a percentage and then winning by 3 points. That is a huge difference. Ron Johnson won largely because even though Russ Feingold, some people expected him to win, he was a recognizable name for the Democratic primary, but the general election voters remember him. They ousted him for a reason. Had Hillary Clinton won the state of Wisconsin, I still think Ron Johnson would have been able to pull off this Senate race. And that's the problem for a lot of these candidates that want to run again. A lot of their victories are, and defeats are remembered by the voters. If they remember voting against them previously, they're not going to want to see their names again. The fact Hillary Clinton outperformed a former incumbent in this exact Senate race is very telling. Don't run previous candidates. But in Indiana, Evan Bayh ran against Todd Young and actually had a much narrower margin than it was for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Looking at the margin of victory for Donald Trump in this state, it was 19 points. And Todd Young only won it by around 10 percentage points. Now, obviously, that's not the worst margin for a Republican, but it's Indiana. It should have been much more Republican than it actually was, but that's because Evan Bayh was a previous senator, especially as someone who's recognizable, who can make it through. He didn't even win the Democratic primary. The Democratic nominee actually dropped out, so the extenuating circumstances might make up for it, but he's a recognizable name. But the thing is, if you're someone who either left or you're someone who was defeated, the voters aren't going to want you again. And that's the problem with running David Perdue again. The GOP has seen this fail twice in 2020. I don't think they want 3 for 3. I mean, looking at the Georgia runoff election results, there's a reason why Jon Ossoff, someone who was touted as a sacrificial lamb, I mentioned him previously. If you remember my channel, I mentioned Jon Ossoff's race in the beginning and the creation of my channel because it was an indicator that Georgia, the races were going to get more competitive and the state was getting bluer. And it did get bluer. But I mentioned Jon Ossoff back in 2019 when he announced that he was going to run, and I said, this doesn't make sense. Jon Ossoff would have been better for the special election. He's a recognizable name in the 6th district and the 6th district alone. He may have raised a lot of money, but he's not a winnable candidate. I was wrong. Jon Ossoff proved me wrong. As we got closer to the general election, I did have some prediction videos showing him winning. I had some of them with him losing. I thought David Perdue would luck out. I really did. Based off what we were seeing so far, the only thing that the Republicans, miscalculated on was election day turnout. And that's partially what I miscalculated on too, that many of us did. But there's a reason why even Jon Ossoff. And I say that because I think Jon Ossoff was a very strong speaker, but could not have won the support, I don't think, without Raphael Warnock being on the ballot or even Kelley Loeffler being on the ballot. I think that Jon Ossoff was individually a strong candidate, but has shown up without winning before. And I think that looking at this race, the fact that Jon Ossoff did better than Joe Biden, a recognizable name amongst the black community, someone who was able to drive up turnout amongst minority voters in the Democratic primary, looking at the regular election results, comparing them to the runoff election, something changed. And while it may have been Donald Trump, it was also David Perdue, someone who was previously elected by Republicans, someone who was previously adored by the Georgia GOP, ousted by some of these same suburban voters that elected him in the first place. When you look at the Atlanta metro area and you take a look at the full results, the reason why they shifted left from November and shifted significantly left from 2016 and 2018 is because this entire state has fundamentally gotten more Democratic, because we are seeing more minority voters in Atlanta. Specifically, we're seeing a huge increase in black turnout relative to the November general election. 3% made a huge difference. Looking at the results, I don't think that David Perdue would be the strongest Republican. I think they could win with David Perdue. I don't think it's likely, because I think that Republicans can win Georgia with any type of nominee, maybe not Marjorie Taylor Greene, but maybe with almost any type of nominee in the state. I think if Doug Collins wants to run against Raphael Warnock, maybe he could win. But I really do think that if David Perdue does run, based off our current environment, based off the way that the Democrats are viewed in Georgia, based off the way Joe Biden is viewed in Georgia, Raphael Warnock's going to win by a larger margin than he did in the runoff. Things can change. We're 2 years away from the midterm election, but things, so far are looking good for the Democratic Party in Georgia. It looks like they're on track to run Stacey Abrams in the governor election, given Brian Kemp's unpopularity, given the Republican Party's unpopularity. They need to salvage every voter they can get. And they're not going to do that by running the same loser that they did before. I will say that plainly, David Perdue lost the Senate race. I simply don't see why they are running him again. I made the same argument about John James in Michigan. I made the same argument about Martha McSally in Arizona. And you know what happened? They lost. You don't run candidates that were defeated even closer than 2 years ago, a year ago for this instance. When we get to the primary season, a year ago, voters are going to look at this name and say, wait a minute, didn't I vote against them before? It wasn't, it wasn't just pro-Democratic vote. It was also anti-Trump and anti-Perdue and anti-Loeffler. And that's what landed the Democratic Party in the majority in the United States Senate. And looking at the scarcity of Senate seats for the Republican Party, let's go ahead and characterize all of the seats they currently hold, because they need to retain every single one of them if they want to become competitive to win back the United States Senate. The Democratic Party is currently at a very strong point, I would say. Even though they're at 50-50, looking at the races that are up in 2022, they could, we could see Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina be toss-ups. Democrats could also see Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire, and Georgia become toss-ups. But outside of that, it can't be a worse majority than what they had in 2016. And on top of that, let's say the Republicans run David Perdue. Honestly, based off our current environment, I'd say Georgia is lean, possibly likely. I would say that. The Democrats also, considering there are retiring incumbents in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, they could win those races. They could absolutely win those races. It does depend a lot on the national environment, but if they do that and they hold on to Arizona and Nevada, where does that put them? That puts them at 52 if they hold on to New Hampshire. I mean, it's not out of the question for the Democratic Party to gain seats, which is why the Republican Party needs to do everything they can, and that does not mean running previous top names. They're top in the Republican Party, actually, maybe not, but top in the Republican Party for primary voters, but they're not amongst general election voters. You don't run former candidates. But David Perdue seems as if he's going to put his personal belief that he can win again over the interest of the Republican Party nationwide. I mean, they should not be surprised if David Perdue loses in 2022. If we find out election night and they call the race for Raphael Warnock till 2028, well, that's it. You can't oust any Democrats till 2026 at a minimum. Is that really a risk worth taking? I mean, you can run someone who's adored by Trump Republicans, but also adored by the suburban vote, someone who has stayed out of the fray, but not enough that they would be criticized by the members of the right wing or by members of the Trump wing of the Republican Party. They can find that. That's possible in Georgia. But David Perdue could easily swoop in and win a primary, but I'm not confident he would win a general election. I'm not confident. And given that every single seat matters in this Senate, every single seat matters, they can't afford to give up Georgia. But they just might do that by choosing David Perdue as the Republican nominee for the 2022 Senate race when everything will come down to the wire. You just lost in 2020. You just lost in 2021. There's no reason for voters to want to vote for you a year and a half later. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.